Elena Brooks sat in a quiet courtroom, watching her husband's lawyer call her unstable, irresponsible, and unfit, while Daniel sat there in his $1,000 suit, calm, untouchable, certain he had already won. He had the money, the connections, the carefully built case designed to leave her with nothing. What he didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the woman he had just called worthless trash in front of a packed courtroom had a mother, and that mother was about to walk through those doors and take her seat at the bench. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The divorce papers had been sitting on the kitchen table for 3 days. Elena Brooks hadn't moved them. She'd walked around them every morning, stepped over Liam's toy trucks on her way to the coffee maker, poured herself a cup she'd barely touched, and stood at the window watching the street below come alive with people who had somewhere to be. She envied them, not for where they were going, but for the fact that they knew. She was 32 years old, and she had no idea where she was going anymore. The papers were aggressive. Even without a law degree, she could feel it in the language. Every line sharpened to a point, every paragraph designed not just to request but to wound. Daniel wasn't asking for a divorce. He was declaring war. Full custody of their 6-year-old son, Liam. Primary residence. Final decision-making authority on education, healthcare, everything. Elena would be granted visitation. Supervised, if his team had anything to say about it. Supervised, like she was a stranger to her own child. She finally picked up the papers that morning, folded them once, and slid them into her bag. Then she went to wake Liam. He was already sitting up in bed when she opened his door, his small face serious the way it got sometimes, too serious for a 6-year-old. He'd been quieter lately. Elena had noticed. Kids noticed everything, even when you thought you were hiding it. "Morning, baby," she said, keeping her voice easy, normal. "Is Daddy coming today?" he asked. She sat on the edge of his bed and smoothed his hair back. "Not today." He nodded like he'd expected that, and went back to picking at the edge of his blanket. Elena watched him for a moment longer than she needed to, then stood up and started talking about breakfast, about what cartoon he wanted to watch, about whether they had enough orange juice. Small talk with her 6-year-old to stop herself from falling apart at 7 in the morning. Her lawyer, Rachel Stein, was waiting for her at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse. She was a few years younger than Elena. With reading glasses, she was always losing on top of her own head, and an earnest quality that might have seemed naive if it weren't paired with genuine intelligence. She worked for a public interest legal firm, not the kind of outfit that usually went up against Daniel's caliber of representation. Elena knew that. Rachel knew it too. "I won't sugarcoat it," Rachel said, after they'd settled at a corner table and Elena had set the papers down between them. "His team filed this way deliberately. They want you to feel overwhelmed before you even walk into the room." "It's working," Elena said flatly. "Good. Notice it. Name it. And then set it aside." Rachel pulled out her own folder, already thick with notes. "They're going to paint a picture of you. Emotionally unstable. Financially irresponsible. Unfit. Those are the 3 pillars. Everything they present is going to circle back to one of those 3. I've never been any of those things. I know, but that's not how this works." Rachel looked at her steadily. "They don't need truth. They need narrative. And right now, their narrative has more money behind it than ours." Elena stared at her coffee. "What do? We tell the truth. Clearly, calmly, and with documentation. We don't match their energy. We don't react to their provocations. We stay steady." Rachel paused. "Can you do that?" Elena thought about all the years she'd been steady. All the years she'd swallowed things down, smoothed things over, kept the peace in a marriage that had long since stopped feeling like one. Steady was the one thing she knew how to be. "Yes," she said. She'd married Daniel Brooks 7 years ago, and for the first year or so, it had felt like a partnership. He was brilliant. That was the thing about Daniel. Genuinely, frighteningly brilliant, with the kind of legal mind that could find a crack in anything and pry it open. She'd admired it once. She'd found it attractive, even. But somewhere in the 2nd year, maybe earlier, if she was honest, the brilliance had turned inward, started working on her. It wasn't dramatic at first. A comment here, a raised eyebrow there. "Are you really wearing that to my firm's event? You work in nonprofit, Elena. You don't understand how this world operates. Your friends are lovely, but they're not exactly on our level, are they?" He never yelled. That was the thing that made it so hard to name. He was always calm, always reasonable, always had a point that sounded just logical enough that she'd find herself half agreeing before she realized what she was agreeing to. He had a lawyer's understanding of language, of how to reframe things, how to shift the ground under your feet so slowly you didn't notice until you were somewhere completely different from where you'd started. By year 3, she'd stopped calling most of her friends. Not because he'd told her to. He never told her to do anything directly. But there were always reasons. Always something he said that made it easier not to maintain those connections. And she'd been tired. Liam was a baby. She was working part-time, and fighting for every friendship felt like one more thing she didn't have the energy for. Her career had quietly compressed too. She'd had ambitions once. She'd been building something meaningful at a community health organization, work she cared about deeply. But Daniel's schedule always took priority, and Daniel's needs always seemed slightly more urgent than hers, and slowly, without ever making a decision to do it, she'd pulled back, scaled down, made herself smaller to fit the space he'd left for her. She'd stayed, through all of it, because of Liam, and because she kept believing, for longer than she should have, that things would change. They hadn't changed. They'd ended. And now Daniel was going to use every single compromise she'd made, every reduced hour and missed opportunity and moment of emotional exhaustion, as evidence that she was unfit. The courtroom on day 3 was fuller than she'd expected. Elena had dressed carefully, a structured dark blazer, simple jewelry, nothing that could be read as either overdressed or careless. She'd thought about it too much, hated that she'd thought about it too much, and gotten herself there anyway. Daniel arrived 7 minutes after she did. She heard him before she saw him. The particular energy of a man accustomed to entering rooms and having them acknowledge him. He came in with 3 members of his legal team, all expensive suits, all radiating the kind of ease that came from knowing you had more resources than the other side. He didn't look at Elena. Not once. Not even a glance in her direction. She'd expected that. It still landed. The judge assigned for the preliminary hearing was a middle-aged man named Judge Farrow, efficient and distracted in the way of someone with too full a docket. He moved through procedural matters quickly and then nodded to Daniel's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Hartwell, to begin. Hartwell was good. Elena had to give him that. He stood at the front of the room with the relaxed authority of someone who'd done this 1,000 times and never lost sleep over it. He didn't attack immediately. He built. Started with facts, dates, records, documented incidents, each one chosen for how it would sound out of context. A missed school pickup in March, an unplanned absence from work in October, a therapy intake form that she'd filled out voluntarily, seeking help for anxiety during an extremely difficult period, now repurposed to suggest fragility. Elena watched it happen and felt something cold settle in her chest. Not panic. Something worse, recognition. This was Daniel's thinking, his logic, his way of taking something real and true and twisting it until it meant the opposite of what it meant. Rachel objected twice. Both times Hartwell smoothly absorbed the objection and kept going. Then they called Daniel to speak. He walked to the front with the same ease he'd had walking in. Composed, measured, the kind of man a courtroom trusted by instinct. He talked about Liam, how much he loved him, how present he'd been, how concerned he'd become about the stability of the home environment. His voice was almost sorrowful. He was doing the performance well. And then something cracked. She'd seen it before, not often, but enough to recognize it. The moment when control became its own pressure, when the effort of maintaining the performance was greater than what was underneath it. He was answering a question from his own attorney, something about Elena's capacity as a mother, and his voice shifted. Just slightly. Tighter. She's never been reliable, he said. Not really. Not the way it matters. A pause. Something passing over his face. She's worthless. His voice was clear now, not low, not muffled. Clear. Absolute trash. She couldn't even raise a child properly if her life depended on it. The courtroom went quiet in an immediate, physical way, like sound had been physically removed from the room. Elena didn't move. She was aware of everything at once. The absolute stillness of the gallery, Rachel's hand going still on her notepad, Judge Farrow's slight backward shift in his chair, the way Daniel's own attorney went very carefully neutral-faced in the practiced way of someone pretending not to have heard. She looked at Daniel. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at the middle distance, The way people do when they've said something and can't take it back and know it. She thought about crying. She had enough grief stored up that she could have. But she didn't. She sat with her hands folded on the table and let the silence do its work. The gallery had begun to murmur, soft, uncomfortable sound, the kind that fills a room when something has crossed a line that everyone agrees on, but no one says out loud. Judge Farrow straightened in his chair and cleared his throat. That was when the door at the back of the courtroom opened. It opened slowly, not with drama, but with a kind of quiet deliberateness, and a woman walked in. Tall, late 50s, a dark tailored suit that said nothing and meant everything. Silver-threaded hair pulled back. She walked to the back row, sat down, and folded her hands in her lap. She looked at no one. And yet Elena, without turning around, knew she was there. She could feel it. The session resumed after a short recess, and Elena spent the first 5 minutes of it unable to focus on a single word Hartwell was saying. She'd whispered to Rachel the moment the gavel went down for the break, leaned in close, kept her voice controlled, but Rachel had heard the thing underneath it. She wasn't supposed to be here, Elena had said. Just that. Rachel had looked at her with a question she didn't ask, and Elena hadn't offered more. There was nothing more she could offer right now, not in this room, not with Daniel 4 feet away, and the whole carefully assembled proceeding waiting to resume. So she sat, and she breathed, and she tried to be the steady woman she'd promised Rachel she could be. The woman in the back row didn't move, didn't speak to anyone, didn't take out a phone or a notepad. She simply watched, the particular kind of watching that comes from years of professional discipline, where nothing gets recorded visibly, but everything gets taken in. Her name was Vanessa Carter, federal judge, 26 years on the bench, 8 at the federal level, a record that had been studied in law school seminars, not because it was controversial, but because it was so consistently precise. She had a reputation for the kind of rulings that took the difficult path, not the popular one, not the expedient one, but the one that held up when examined from every angle. She was also Elena's mother, and they hadn't spoken in over 4 years. It had not been a clean break. There was no single moment, no dramatic confrontation that explained the silence between them. It was more like something that had eroded over a long time and then simply stopped being worth maintaining. Vanessa had raised Elena alone after Elena's father left when she was 9. She'd done it with iron discipline and an absolute certainty that the right way to prepare a child for the world was to make them tough enough to handle it. No softness, no slack, expectations that felt, to a child, more like demands. Love expressed through correction rather than comfort. Elena had done well by almost every external measure. Good grades, a strong moral center, real ambition. But she'd also grown up feeling like she was always being evaluated, always coming close to a standard but never quite reaching it. And as she got older, the resentment had built. The final break had come from something she still couldn't fully articulate. A combination of things said and unsaid over years, culminating in a conversation just before Elena's wedding. Vanessa had expressed reservations about Daniel. Not in an emotional way. Vanessa didn't do emotional. In a precise, analyzed way, as if she'd run him through some internal assessment and found gaps. She'd laid out her concerns with the same detached clarity she brought to everything. Elena, who had just spent 2 years having her own judgment quietly dismantled by the man she was planning to marry, had heard her mother's doubts as one more instance of being told she was wrong. One more version of not trusting Elena's own choices. She'd told Vanessa, calmly and completely, that she was done asking for her approval. The wedding had happened. Vanessa had attended. They'd exchanged functional words since. Birthdays, holidays, a few texts about Liam. Nothing real. Nothing that bridged the silence between who they'd been to each other and who they were now. And now Vanessa Carter was sitting in the back row of a courtroom, watching her daughter's husband try to destroy her. Daniel didn't know who she was. That much was obvious. He'd barely glanced at the back of the room when they'd reconvened, and when he did, his gaze slid right past the woman in the dark suit the way you look at scenery. A face in a gallery. An observer with no relevance. That confidence, the particular flavor of his confidence, the kind that didn't consider what it might be missing, had always been both his greatest asset and his blindest spot. He genuinely didn't imagine a world in which someone could walk into a room and be more powerful than him. Not this room. Not in a proceeding he'd architected from the ground up. Rachel was noticing something different. Elena could see it in the way she was sitting, that almost still quality that meant her mind was working fast. During the afternoon session, as Hartwell began introducing witness statements, Rachel had started marking things in her notepad with a different kind of urgency. Not just recording, cross-referencing. Two of the statements had similar language. Oddly similar. Not the kind of overlap that came from people independently arriving at the same observations, but the kind that came from people being told what to say and not being quite creative enough to vary it. A former co-worker of Elena's spoke about persistent emotional volatility. A neighbor used the phrase seemed unable to maintain basic routines, both within the same week. Both using constructed clinical-sounding language that didn't match the way people actually talked about someone they'd casually observed. Rachel circled both instances and drew a line between them and said nothing. She didn't have the resources to challenge it right now. She lacked the documentation, the access, the time. But she was watching. And later, if there was a later, she would have something to work with. Vanessa, from the back of the room, was watching something else entirely. She watched the way Daniel's attorney and Daniel communicated, the micro shifts, the tiny signals. When Hartwell introduced the neighbor's statement, Daniel had allowed himself a small, private satisfaction, a barely visible loosening around the shoulders. He'd known what that statement would contain before it was read. Vanessa had noted it. She watched the way the temporary judge, Farrow, had reacted to Daniel's outburst earlier, not with censure, but with discomfort. The kind of discomfort that came from not wanting to disrupt an established dynamic. Farrow wasn't corrupt. He was simply running on autopilot, and this case had been set up to benefit from autopilot. She watched Elena. She watched her daughter sit at that table for 5 hours with her spine straight and her expression, even and her hands absolutely still, and she understood what that cost. She'd taught Elena to be that composed. She'd trained it into her, through years of drill sergeant discipline and iron expectations. She believed she was doing the right thing, preparing her for a world that would require exactly this. The ability to hold yourself together when someone was trying to take everything apart. Watching it now, she couldn't tell if she was proud or devastated. The recess on day 5 came just after 2 in the afternoon. The hallway outside the courtroom was polished marble and too much echoing footstep noise. Elena had gone to get water. She needed 10 minutes away from the room, from the accumulation of being witnessed in her own dismantling. She stood by a window at the end of the hall, watching a street 2 floors below, letting herself just breathe. She heard Daniel's voice before she heard his words. He was behind her, around the corner of the corridor, speaking quietly, the controlled low register he used when he wanted to be heard by exactly one person. She couldn't see him. She didn't move. "No one's coming to save you," he said. "Not anymore. You should start thinking about what it means to lose." A pause. Someone murmured something. She thought it might be one of his associates. "She has nothing," Daniel said. "She never did. She just doesn't know it yet." Elena closed her eyes, counted to 3, and turned to walk back. She nearly walked into Vanessa. Her mother was standing at the edge of the corridor, just past the turn, close enough that she would have heard every word Daniel said. Her expression was completely neutral. It was the expression Elena had spent her whole childhood learning to read. The face her mother put on when something had landed and she was deciding what to do with it. They looked at each other for 2 seconds that felt considerably longer. Then Elena went back to the courtroom, and Vanessa followed 3 minutes later and returned to her seat in the back row. On the morning of day 7, the court clerk stood at the front of the room as people were settling in and made the announcement with the brisk, slightly apologetic tone of someone delivering administrative news. Due to a scheduling revision, Judge Farrow would no longer be presiding over this matter. A replacement judge had been assigned, effective immediately. Daniel was leaning back slightly in his chair, still carrying the ease of a man who'd spent a week watching things go his way. One of his associates was saying something to him in a low voice. He nodded, half listening, the way you nod when someone is telling you something that doesn't matter. Rachel sat up a little straighter. Something about the way the clerk had said it, that particular administrative neutrality, had put a small, alert pressure between her shoulder blades. Elena was looking at the door to the judge's chambers. The clerk continued, "The Honorable Vanessa Carter will be presiding." Daniel stopped nodding. A door opened, and Vanessa Carter walked to the bench. The last word the clerk spoke, Carter moved through the room the way a stone moves through still water. Not loudly, but with a radius. Most people in the courtroom didn't know the name. They registered the announcement the way you register any procedural update. A minor recalibration, a few seconds of adjustment, and then back to wherever their attention had been. The gallery shifted. Someone behind Elena uncapped a pen. A court officer adjusted his position near the door. But Daniel knew the name. Elena didn't look back at him. She didn't need to. She could feel the quality of the silence at his table change. That particular kind of stillness that isn't calm, but is its opposite. The stillness of someone whose mind has just run ahead of the moment and not liked what it found there. She kept her eyes on the door to the judge's chambers. It opened without drama. Vanessa Carter walked through it in her robes, and the bailiff called the room to order with the standard instruction. All rise. And everyone stood, the way they always stood, the way the room always moved in that practiced, automatic deference to whoever occupied that bench. But the person occupying it this time made the ordinary motion feel entirely different. Vanessa took her seat, set down the folder she was carrying, looked at the room with the measured, level attention that Elena had grown up watching across dinner tables and kitchen counters, and, more than once, the front seat of a car in silence that lasted the whole drive home. "Be seated," she said. Elena sat, and for the first time since she'd walked into this building 3 days ago, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not relief. Not quite. Something more complicated. The particular sensation of a situation becoming simultaneously better and harder at the same time. Daniel's attorney moved quickly. Hartwell was on his feet before Vanessa had fully settled, his voice carrying the smooth, practiced urgency of a man making a professional assessment while performing reasonable concern. "Your Honor, with respect, given the relationship between the presiding judge and one of the parties in this matter, we would request the court consider whether recusal might be appropriate to ensure." "The court has considered it," Vanessa said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "My record on the bench is available for review. In 26 years, I have presided over matters involving parties I've known personally, professionally, and in some cases far more directly than this. My rulings have been reviewed and upheld at every level. If you would like to file a formal recusal motion, you may do so. You will also need to be prepared for it to be heard on its merits." A brief pause. "Is there anything else before we proceed?" Hartwell sat down. Elena exhaled very slowly through her nose. Rachel, beside her, had gone still in that particular way, the way she did when she was recalibrating, when she was understanding that the landscape had shifted and she needed to figure out where everything was now. She looked down at her notepad, then back up. Then she wrote something, circled it twice, and kept watching. The first thing Vanessa did was methodical. She worked back through the record, not dramatically, not with accusations, but with the precise and unhurried attention of someone who read documents for a living and did not accept approximation. She asked for the transcripts from days 3 and 5 to be made available. She reviewed the list of witnesses presented so far and the nature of their testimony. She noted, without emphasis, 2 instances in which witness statements had been admitted with documentation that she found insufficient for the claims being made. "This statement," she said, holding up a page from the record, the neighbor's testimony, Elena knew without being able to read it, "is being presented as evidence of habitual behavioral pattern. Can you point me to the corroborating documentation that establishes the frequency and duration of the observations being cited here?" Hartwell stood. "Your Honor, the witness statement itself." "The witness statement contains conclusions," Vanessa said. "I'm asking for the observational record that supports those conclusions. Dates, times, specific incidents. The kind of documentation that would allow me to evaluate whether this reflects pattern or anecdote." She set the page down. "Please have that for me before your next witness is called." It was the same thing Rachel had circled in her notepad 2 days ago. Elena understood this, sitting at her table, with perfect and painful clarity. Her mother had identified the same weakness Rachel had noticed, in approximately 90 seconds. Hartwell conferred quietly with his team. Someone typed something. Someone else leaned over to look at a screen. There was a measured quality to the activity that suggested things being checked that the presenter was now less certain of than he had been this morning. The coached quality of those testimonies was not going to survive this level of scrutiny. Hartwell was smart enough to understand that already. Something shifted in Rachel that afternoon that Elena had not seen before. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, no sudden blazing confidence, no courtroom movie moment. It was subtler than that. It was Rachel asking a follow-up question she'd have let go 2 days ago. It was her voice carrying just slightly more weight when she pushed back on a characterization. It was the way she stopped angling her body slightly deferentially toward Hartwell's side of the room and started occupying her own space at the table more fully. The change in the room's tone had given her permission. Not from Vanessa directly. Vanessa hadn't shown Rachel any particular favor. She hadn't needed to. The rigor she'd applied to Hartwell's presentation had simply rebalanced the room's implicit assumptions about who held the credibility here. And Rachel, who was smart and prepared and had simply been outweighed rather than outclassed, had felt that rebalancing and used it. She requested the opportunity to re-examine the former co-worker's testimony from day 5. Vanessa allowed it. The woman, she'd been poised in her original appearance, composed in the way of someone who had rehearsed, was less poised this time. Rachel's questions were focused and specific. Not aggressive, just specific. When did you observe this? Where were you standing? Who else was present? The answers began to acquire a soft, retreating quality. Vaguer than they'd been. Less certain. The phrases that had sounded confident in the original testimony. Persistent emotional volatility, unable to maintain basic routines, now had nowhere to land. Asked to describe a specific incident that had led her to that conclusion, the witness offered something that, when stripped of its framing, was simply a woman having a hard week and asking a coworker for a few minutes. Vanessa listened, said nothing, wrote something in her own notes. Daniel was watching all of this with the focused attention of someone trying to assess damage. Elena, in her peripheral vision, could see him at his table, not the relaxed version of him she'd watched walk into this room on day 3, but something more constrained, more internal. He was still in the expensive suit. His posture was still controlled, but the ease was gone. She was surprised to discover that looking at him now, she felt almost nothing. Not satisfaction, not residual affection, just a clean, empty recognition. This is who he always was. There was a moment that afternoon that no one in the gallery would have marked as significant. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Vanessa had called a brief pause to review a filing, and the room had settled into that low ambient shuffle of people waiting. Papers moving, someone coughing, the quiet conversation of court officers near the door. In that pause, Elena had turned her head just slightly, not back toward her mother's bench, but sideways, looking at nothing in particular, just the middle distance of her own thoughts. And Vanessa, on the bench, had looked up from the document she was reading. Not at Hartwell, not at Rachel, toward Elena. It lasted 3 seconds, maybe less. Elena didn't see it. She was looking the other way. Vanessa returned to the document. It was near the end of the afternoon session when Hartwell, attempting to regain some momentum, moved to introduce a financial summary that his team had prepared, a document outlining Elena's financial situation over the past 3 years, designed to support the argument that she was economically incapable of providing stable care. Vanessa examined the document. Then she looked across at Daniel's table. "Counsel," she said, "this summary draws from account records and asset declarations. Before I can admit this as characterization of the respondent's financial situation, I'd like to see the full documentation, both parties' asset declarations, including all accounts and transfers registered in the past 36 months. A pause. Including any transfers not reflected in the respondent's filing. Hartwell's response was measured, but it arrived about half a second too late. "Of course, Your Honor. We'll have the full documentation prepared. I'd like it by tomorrow morning," Vanessa said. Daniel, at his table, said something in a very low voice to his associate. The associate looked at the document on the table, then at the back of Daniel's chair, and said nothing. The request was orderly, procedurally correct, completely unremarkable in form, and it had come directly at the thing Daniel had most carefully arranged to keep sealed. That evening, Rachel called Elena just after 9. Elena was sitting on the living room floor with Liam. He'd wanted to build something with his wooden blocks, a tower that kept falling over, and they'd been at it for 40 minutes without completing it, which was somehow exactly what Elena had needed. She answered on the second ring. "You need to hear something," Rachel said. She didn't sound nervous the way she usually did when delivering difficult news. She sounded like someone who had been handed an unexpected tool and was figuring out how to use it properly. Tell me, the financial summary they submitted today, I've been going back through it. There are gaps, not errors, gaps. Specific accounts that appear in the original joint filing but aren't reflected in Daniel's asset declaration for this case. A brief pause. That kind of omission isn't accidental, Elena. That's architecture. Elena watched Liam set another block on the tower, his small face entirely concentrated on the problem of balance. How much? Enough to matter. I need more time to trace it fully. But what I can tell you tonight is that the picture they've been painting of you, financially dependent, economically unstable, it wasn't just spin. It was cover. Elena was quiet for a moment. He was moving money, she said. I think so, yes. She thought about the years of being told she didn't understand how finances worked. The joint accounts she'd had access to but never really managed. The times she'd asked about their financial situation and received answers just complex enough to satisfy her, and in the conversation, she'd thought, at the time, that she was simply not as financially literate as him. He'd cultivated that impression carefully. He'd been building an exit for years. Okay, she said. What do? We make sure Vanessa Carter gets everything she asked for tomorrow, Rachel said. And we let the gaps speak for themselves. The morning session on day 8 began with the financial documentation Vanessa had requested. Hartwell presented it with the same smooth authority he brought to everything. But Elena had spent enough time watching Daniel to recognize the difference between a man who was confident and a man who was performing confidence. The distinction, once you knew to look for it, was unmistakable. He was performing. Vanessa worked through the documents methodically. She did not hurry. She asked questions in the same level, unhurried tone she'd used all week, and each question arrived at precisely the thing it was designed to arrive at, with no excess motion. It was like watching someone navigate a building they'd memorized the blueprint of. Every turn taken cleanly, no steps wasted. These transfer records, she said, holding up a page. This account. Can you explain why this doesn't appear in the respondent's initial declaration? Hartwell had a prepared answer. It was technically sound, something about the account being classified under a business holding rather than personal assets, a distinction with legal legitimacy that nonetheless required examination. Vanessa examined it. She requested the business holding documentation. She noted a date of formation that fell, precisely 14 months after Elena and Daniel's wedding. She didn't say what that meant. She didn't need to. The date sat in the record and meant what it meant. Rachel had been watching the exchange with the focused, quiet intensity of someone watching a play they've already read, understanding each moment before it arrived, and still affected by the seeing of it. She'd spent the previous night pulling together everything she could on Daniel's financial movements, and what she had was incomplete but directional. She had enough to push. She requested permission to introduce supplementary documentation regarding asset transfers. Vanessa allowed it. The room, which had been operating at a low hum of procedural activity all morning, got a little quieter. The document Rachel introduced wasn't the full picture. She was careful about that. She didn't overextend, didn't claim more than she could support. She presented what she had. 3 specific transfers, across an 18-month period, moving money from shared accounts into instruments that wouldn't appear on a standard asset declaration. The amounts were significant. The timing was deliberate, each one occurring either immediately before or after a period in which Daniel had, according to the record, expressed concerns about the marriage's stability. He had been preparing, systematically, while telling Elena that everything was fine, while accusing her of being financially irresponsible, while building the narrative of her inadequacy that would eventually serve as the foundation of this custody case. He had been quietly ensuring that if, and when the end came, she would be standing on nothing. The courtroom received this information in a particular kind of silence. Not the shocked silence of Act One's outburst. That had been immediate, visceral. This was slower, more considered. The silence of people recalibrating an entire understanding of what they'd been watching. Hartwell objected to the characterization, not to the documents themselves, but to the framing. Vanessa sustained part of his objection and overruled the rest. She told Rachel to confine herself to what the documentation established. What the documentation established was enough. Daniel was very still. Elena had a clear sight line to his profile from where she sat, and she watched him the way you watch a structure under pressure, looking for the places where the strain was showing. His hands were flat on the table in front of him. His jaw was set. His eyes were moving, but not with the scanning quality of someone processing new information. They had the fixed, forward quality of someone working through what to do next. What levers still existed? What moves remained? It was the same quality she'd watched in him across 7 years of marriage. The constant calculation. The assessment. She'd once found it impressive, the sheer engine of it, the way he was always 3 steps ahead. She understood now that she had been, for most of that time, one of the variables being managed. His associate passed him a note. He read it without visible reaction and wrote something back. It was during the afternoon recess that the first crack appeared publicly. One of the witnesses from day 5, a man named Gregory Olson, who'd been presented as a former colleague of Elena's with observations about her professional conduct, requested through his own attorney to revise his testimony. Vanessa allowed it. The room snapped to attention. Olson was a trim, gray-haired man who had, in his original appearance, delivered his statements with the crisp certainty of someone who had been well coached. He stood before the court now with a different quality. Not remorseful exactly. More like someone who had done a calculation and arrived at an answer he didn't like, but couldn't argue with. "I was told what to focus on," he said, when Rachel asked him directly whether anyone had shaped the content of his testimony. The framing. How to characterize what I'd observed. "I was contacted about 3 weeks before I appeared." He looked once at Daniel's table. "I was told this was standard practice." Preparation. "And who contacted you?" Rachel asked. He named one of Daniel's associates. Not Daniel directly. One step removed, the kind of architecture that left a principal insulated. But the distance was narrow, and it was in the record now. Hartwell made objections. Vanessa ruled on each one. The testimony stood. Daniel's hands were no longer flat on the table. Rachel had found something else the previous night, and she'd been holding it, waiting for the right moment, the right level of foundational damage before introducing it. She brought it forward in the late afternoon session, with the careful, deliberate pacing of someone who understood that the most important things shouldn't arrive in a rush. Court assignment records. The judge initially assigned to this case, Judge Farrow, had been assigned to 3 other cases involving Daniel's firm in the past 4 years. In 2 of those cases, opposing parties had filed informal complaints about the handling of proceedings, complaints that had been reviewed and dismissed, but were on record. In one of those cases, a favorable ruling had been issued on a motion that the opposing counsel had later described, in a written review request, as lacking sufficient evidentiary basis. This was not proof of anything. Rachel was careful to frame it that way. It was a pattern, a question, a set of circumstances that, taken together, raised the kind of concern that warranted examination. Vanessa looked at the records for a long time. "I'll be ordering these materials preserved," she said. "And I'll be notifying the relevant oversight body that this court has identified information that may warrant an independent review of judicial assignment processes in a number of linked matters." The room understood what that meant, even stated in its precise procedural language. It meant that the structure Daniel had built, the careful arrangement of pieces that had ensured a favorable environment before the first word was ever spoken in this courtroom, was now visible. And once something was visible to a federal judge, it didn't disappear. Daniel's lead attorney requested a private conference at the close of the afternoon session. It was granted. Whatever was discussed in that conference took 45 minutes and emerged without resolution. Hartwell's face, when he returned, carrying the particular blankness of a professional who had been asked to perform a function he now had serious reservations about. Daniel, leaving the building, walked past Elena in the lobby without looking at her. She was standing near the door, waiting for Rachel to finish a call. He walked past close enough that she could have spoken to him. She had nothing to say. She watched him push through the glass door into the afternoon light, still in the expensive suit, still carrying the leather bag, still occupying the exterior shape of the man she'd married. But something had changed in the way he was moving. He'd always moved with a forward quality, purposeful, propelled. He was walking differently now, heavier, like someone carrying the weight of a story they'd been telling themselves for years and had just run out of the energy to maintain. His car was waiting. He got in. It pulled away. Rachel found her still standing there. "How are you doing?" she asked. Not the professional version of the question, but the real one. Elena thought about it honestly. "I'm angry," she said. "I wasn't for a while. I thought I'd gotten past it. But seeing those transfer records today," she stopped. "He was doing it while I was home with Liam. While I was making myself smaller because I thought I was the problem. He was sitting across from me at dinner and moving money out of our future." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "You have every right to be angry." "I know." Elena looked at the glass door where Daniel had left. "I also know I can't let it run me. Not in there." She turned away from the door. "Not anywhere." They walked out together into the cooling afternoon, and Elena pulled her jacket tighter against the air and let herself think, for a moment, about Liam. About picking him up tomorrow. About the wooden block tower they still hadn't managed to complete. About the completely ordinary beauty of a problem that had nothing to do with any of this. Then her phone buzzed. Rachel looked at her own phone at the same moment. It was a notification, a filing alert from the court system. An emergency motion had been submitted. Rachel read it first. Her eyebrows went up slightly. Vanessa Carter had ordered the sealed financial documentation from Daniel's case to be transferred to a formal legal review, and had simultaneously requested that Daniel's firm provide a full accounting of its involvement in the matters linked to the court assignment pattern sheet identified. Daniel hadn't been served yet. He would be, in the morning. Elena read the notification twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket. "Tomorrow," she said. Rachel nodded. "Tomorrow." That night, Elena sat at her kitchen table after Liam was asleep. The divorce papers were no longer on the table. She'd moved them weeks ago, organized them into a folder that Rachel now had. The table was just a table again. She had a cup of tea she wasn't drinking and the particular quiet of a late hour and a sleeping child, and she sat in it and let herself think about her mother. It was strange, watching Vanessa work. Strange and specific in a way she hadn't anticipated. She'd expected, she realized, to feel either grateful or resentful, some clean emotion that she could handle cleanly. What she felt instead was more tangled. The recognition of herself in the way Vanessa moved through a problem, the pattern of thought she'd inherited and spent years trying to distinguish herself from, now deployed on her behalf. She had questions she couldn't answer yet. Whether Vanessa had sought out this assignment or been placed into it through the court's process. Whether she was here because she'd heard somehow and made it her business to be here, or whether the universe had simply, strangely, intersected her path with Elena's at the exact moment it mattered. Whether any of that changed anything between them, she didn't know. What she knew was that Daniel had called her worthless in a room full of people, and that the thing he'd built to destroy her was now dismantling itself one document at a time. She finished her tea, turned off the kitchen light, went to check on Liam, who was sound asleep with one arm around the toy truck he'd been refusing to let out of his bed lately. She stood in his doorway for a long moment. The file order Vanessa had issued would reach Daniel by morning. Rachel had said it plainly. This is no longer just a divorce case. It was something much larger now. Something that would require answers in rooms beyond this courtroom. Something that had been built over years and would take time to fully come apart. Elena turned off Liam's night light, leaving only the small glow of his turtle lamp, and walked back down the hall. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring exactly. But for the first time since she'd sat at this table staring at divorce papers 3 weeks ago, she wasn't afraid of finding out. Daniel received the notice at 7:43 in the morning. He was in his car, sitting in the parking structure beneath his firm's building, engine still running. His driver had handed him the envelope without comment. It had been waiting at the front desk when the car pulled around. Daniel had opened it with the automatic motion of a man who received legal correspondence the way other people received mail, routinely, without particular anticipation. He read it twice. Then he sat with it in his lap and looked at the concrete wall in front of the car. The notice was formal, precise, the kind of document that didn't raise its voice because it didn't need to. It outlined the court's findings from the previous day's session, the identified gaps in asset declaration, the pattern flagged in judicial assignment records, the ordered transfer of materials to formal legal review. It notified Daniel that he was required to produce, within 5 business days, a complete accounting of all financial instruments, transfers, and holdings not previously disclosed in these proceedings. It informed him that the court had simultaneously forwarded relevant materials to the State Bar Association for independent review. It was signed by Vanessa Carter. He sat in the car for 11 minutes. His driver, accustomed to silence, said nothing. Then he got out, rode the elevator to the 14th floor, and walked toward his office. He didn't make it to his office. His senior partner, William Ashby, was waiting in the corridor, not in the manner of someone who happened to be passing. In the manner of someone who had known Daniel was arriving and had positioned himself accordingly. "My office," Ashby said. No greeting. No preamble. Daniel followed him. The meeting lasted 22 minutes. Daniel emerged from it without his lead attorney. Hartwell's firm had called that morning to notify the partners that they were withdrawing from representation, citing a conflict of interest that had only recently become apparent to them. The language was careful. The meaning was not. Daniel's name, Ashby told him, was now a liability. Internal auditors had been assigned to review his caseload for the past 4 years. He was being asked, Ashby had said, with the emphasis of a man who meant told, to take a temporary step back from client-facing work while the review was conducted. His access to firm databases had been restricted. His assistant had been reassigned. Daniel walked to his office, sat at his desk, and looked at the view he'd spent 7 years earning. By mid-morning, the story had a shape. A legal journalist named Patricia Graves had been following the case for 3 days. She covered the court's beat for a regional outlet that lawyers read and feared in roughly equal measure. She'd noticed the judicial reassignment. She'd noticed Hartwell's withdrawal. She'd pulled the public record of the court's orders from the previous day and spent 2 hours on the phone with sources who wouldn't go on record but were willing to confirm, broadly, the direction things were moving. Her piece, published just after 11, was careful. It didn't allege what hadn't been proven. It didn't need to. The facts it laid out, the reassignment, the financial documentation gaps, the witness recantation, the Bar Association referral, assembled themselves into a picture that readers could construct without being handed it directly. The headline read, "High-profile attorney under investigation in custody case scandal." By noon, it had been shared widely enough that Ashby's assistant was fielding calls from 2 other outlets. Elena didn't see the article until Rachel texted her a link just after lunch. She was at Liam's school. She'd volunteered to help with a classroom activity that morning, something involving construction paper and an ambitious project about seasons that the teacher had planned with considerably more optimism than the 6-year-olds had met it with. Liam had sat beside her at the table, carefully cutting a yellow circle that was meant to be the sun, his small tongue between his teeth in concentration. He hadn't asked about court in 3 days. He'd stopped asking about when Daddy was coming in the same breath as his other daily questions. Elena didn't know exactly what to make of that, whether it was children's resilience or children's grief wearing a quiet face. She watched him cut his yellow circle with the focused seriousness he brought to things he cared about and thought about how completely she would burn the world down for him, if she ever had to. She hadn't needed to burn anything. Things were burning on their own. She read the article in her car in the school parking lot while Liam was in afternoon class. She read it straight through without stopping, then sat with her phone in her lap and looked out the windshield at a row of parked minivans and thought about all the mornings she'd made herself small so the day could pass without incident. She texted Rachel back, "I saw it." Rachel responded, "Call me when you can. There's more." The more was this. A woman named Diane Whitfield had contacted Rachel's office the previous afternoon through a method that suggested she'd thought carefully about how to do it without being easily traced. She was a former client, not of Daniel's firm directly, but of a matter in which Daniel had served as opposing counsel 5 years ago. A property dispute. A case that had settled, the terms of which Diane had signed away under circumstances she now described, in careful and specific language, as coercive. Rachel had spent the morning on the phone with her. The parallels were not subtle. Manufactured pressure. A narrative constructed around Diane's instability. Documents that had arrived at inconvenient moments. Settlement terms that had been presented as her only reasonable option, with the alternative framed as a process that would destroy her professionally and financially. She hadn't come forward at the time. She had reasons for that. Family, vulnerability, the particular exhaustion of a person who has been made to feel that fighting is the same as losing. She was coming forward now because she'd read a piece about Elena's case 3 days ago and recognized something. She said it like she was describing her own memory. Rachel told Elena, over the phone that afternoon. Different details. Same architecture. Elena was quiet for a moment. Will she testify? She's considering it. She wants to meet first, understand what it means for her. Whatever she decides, Elena said. She doesn't owe us anything. Rachel paused. I know, but I think she needs to say it out loud. And I think a courtroom might be the right room for that. Daniel spent the afternoon on the phone, one call after another, working down a list of names, people who owed him, people who'd benefited from proximity to him, people who had every reason to want to maintain a working relationship. The calls were productive in the sense that they connected. They were not productive in the sense that anyone was willing to do what he needed. People were polite. People expressed concern. People said versions of let's see how this develops, and I need to be careful about my own exposure right now in the measured, self-protective language of professionals who could see which way something was falling and had no intention of being underneath it. He tried 3 people who could have applied pressure on the Bar Association review. One didn't answer. One told him, gently and firmly, that there was nothing to be done at this stage. The third told him that calling about it was not, in itself, a good idea. He put his phone down and looked at his hands. They were trembling slightly. Not much, enough that he noticed it, which was enough. He'd built this life with these hands. He'd argued in courtrooms, written motions that changed outcomes, cultivated a reputation that opened doors before he knocked. He believed, without exactly examining the belief, that the architecture of what he'd built was solid enough to withstand anything. Because he'd built it carefully. Because he was smarter than most of the people in his way. He was only now beginning to understand that he hadn't been careful. He'd been arrogant. And arrogance didn't build anything solid. It just created the convincing appearance of it. Elena and Vanessa met that evening. Not by plan, or not by Elena's plan. She'd come out of a pharmacy near her apartment, Liam's cold medication in a bag, and Vanessa was standing on the sidewalk outside. Not in her robes, not in the formal suit she wore to the bench. A dark coat, no briefcase. She looked, for the first time in Elena's recent memory, like a person rather than a position. They stood and looked at each other in the way of people who have too much to say and no established framework for saying it. I didn't know you'd be here, Elena said. I live 4 blocks from here, Vanessa said. I always have. Elena absorbed that. 4 blocks. For the entire 4 years of their silence. She hadn't known. Walk with me, Vanessa said. It wasn't entirely a request. They walked. Liam's medication bag bumped gently against Elena's hip. The street was quiet at this hour, weeknight quiet, the kind of muted activity that felt specifically urban and specific to no city in particular. Vanessa spoke first. I didn't arrange to be on this case, she said. I want you to know that. The assignment came through standard rotation. I could have recused myself. A pause. I chose not to. Why? Because I looked at the record. Vanessa's voice was even, but the evenness had something underneath it that Elena recognized. The tone her mother used when she was holding something tightly in order to say it clearly. I looked at what was being built against you, and I knew that if I stepped away, I would be stepping away from the right thing to do in order to avoid something uncomfortable. You mean me. I mean us. Vanessa stopped walking. I've avoided that my whole life, Elena. Uncomfortable things. Things that required me to be in them, not above them. I thought that was strength. I trained you to think the same thing. Elena kept her eyes on the middle distance. The pharmacy bag. The ordinary street. You always show up when it's too late, she said. The words came out quieter than she'd intended, not as an accusation, just as a fact she'd been carrying. I know. Vanessa's voice didn't flinch. I came because I saw what he was doing. I'm not asking you to forgive that timing. I'm just telling you it's true. They stood in silence for a long moment. It wasn't comfortable silence. It was the kind that meant something was being held open rather than closed. Then Elena shifted Liam's medication to her other hand and said, I need to get home. He's waiting. Vanessa nodded. They parted without resolution, without an embrace, without any of the tidy emotional gestures that would have made it feel concluded. But Elena walked the 4 blocks home with something different in her chest than she'd carried on the way out. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Something more like the first acknowledgement that the distance between them was not permanent geography. Day 12 arrived with a different weight than the previous ones. The courtroom looked the same wood paneling, same gallery seating, same low institutional lighting that made everyone look slightly tired. But the people in it were not the same. The media presence had grown. 3 journalists Elena recognized from Patricia Graves' outlet, and 2 she didn't. Legal professionals who had no direct connection to the case but had been following the record. People from Daniel's professional circle who were there, Elena understood, less out of support than out of the need to see what happened next. The proceedings had moved beyond the framing of a divorce. What had begun as a custody dispute now carried the formal architecture of misconduct hearings. Not criminal, not yet, but adjacent to it. Testimonies were no longer just character assessments. They were account entries in a larger ledger. Vanessa had reconvened with the same composed authority she'd carried since day 7, but the room's relationship to that authority had changed. People deferred to it differently now, not as a formality, but as something earned and verified. She had not overreached, had not been theatrical, had not operated outside the precise scope of her role. And because she hadn't, every action she'd taken had stood. Daniel arrived without Hartwell. He had new counsel, a single attorney, competent but not elite, the kind of representation that said something had changed about his resources. Diane Whitfield had decided to testify. Rachel had told Elena the previous evening, in a message that was brief and careful, "She's coming." She made her decision. Let's honor it. Diane was a woman in her mid-40s with the specific bearing of someone who had spent years practicing not showing what she was feeling and had recently decided to stop. She sat in the witness stand with her hands in her lap and her eyes level, and she answered Rachel's questions the way you answer questions you have rehearsed, not for performance, but for precision, to make sure you say the thing you mean and not drift into approximation. She described what had happened to her 5 years ago in the measured language of someone reporting facts. She described the way the pressure had arrived, not as a threat, but as a series of implications. The way the narrative of her unreliability had been constructed from selected incidents presented out of context. The way she'd been made to feel that the case against her was stronger than it was, and that the consequences of fighting it would exceed any benefit she might gain. The way documents had appeared at strategic moments. The way she'd signed the settlement not because it was right, but because she'd been made to believe she had no other option. The courtroom was quiet in the way of people who were listening carefully. When Rachel asked her why she'd come forward now, Diane looked briefly toward Elena, not for permission, but in recognition. "Because I've been watching this case," she said, "and I kept seeing the same moves, the same sequence. And I thought, if she can do it, if she can sit in that room and say the true thing clearly, then I can do it too." Rachel had built something methodical from the weeks of digging. She presented it in the afternoon session, not as an attack, but as a pattern. Multiple instances, multiple parties, across different matters, different years, a consistent methodology, manufactured instability narratives, strategically timed documentation, orchestrated witness testimony, settlements or outcomes that served Daniel's interests or those of his clients through coercion rather than fact. Each instance was presented with specificity, dates, records, documentation that had been gathered through the court's own orders and through material that had surfaced in the wake of the case going public. She didn't characterize. She didn't editorialize. She laid the record down and let the room construct the picture. By the time she finished, Daniel's new attorney had filed 6 objections. Vanessa had sustained 2 of them. The other 4 had not changed what the record now contained. Daniel broke in the late afternoon. It happened during cross-examination, Rachel asking him to explain a specific transfer, a specific date, a specific sequence of decisions. He had been holding himself together all day with the visible effort of a man who knew that composure was all he had left and was managing it carefully. But there was a particular question about a communication with the original court clerk regarding scheduling that arrived at something he hadn't fully anticipated. His answer started controlled, became more controlled in the way that control becomes its own evidence when the answer underneath is unstable. Then his voice tightened and something shifted in his face, the mask that had served him for years beginning, under this specific and documented pressure, to show its seams. "I built everything," he said. The answer that was supposed to be procedural had become something else. "Everything in that courtroom. Everything in my firm. She had nothing when I met her. Nothing. She would have nothing now if it weren't." He stopped himself. The room waited. Vanessa said, quietly, "Mr. Brooks, answer the specific question that was asked." His attorney put a hand on the table in a gesture that meant stop. Daniel looked at his attorney, looked at Vanessa, looked, for the first time in many days, at Elena. Elena was looking back at him, not with hatred, not with triumph, with the particular clear-eyed attention of someone who has finally, completely, seen what they were looking at and can name it without flinching. He said nothing further. Elena took the stand the following morning. She had thought about this moment for weeks, had dreaded it, had prepared for it with Rachel in their small conference room, had rehearsed it in her head at night while Liam slept. But sitting in the witness stand, looking out at the courtroom, she found that the dread had been replaced by something cleaner and harder. Not courage, exactly, more like the resolution of a long uncertainty. This was what it had all been building toward. Not a performance, not a defense, just the truth said out loud in the right room. Rachel's questions were structured to let Elena speak, not to prompt, to create space. Elena spoke about the marriage in the specific, concrete way of someone who has sorted through years of accumulated experience and identified what actually happened, as opposed to the version they were made to believe. She didn't cry. She didn't manage her effect for the room's benefit. She was simply present and accurate. She described the isolation, how it had worked, how gradual it was, how it had arrived not through prohibition, but through the slow accumulation of discouragements. She described the financial control, how she'd been managed out of understanding their shared finances, made to feel the subject was beyond her, while money moved in ways she couldn't see. She described the weaponizing of his legal knowledge, how disagreements in their marriage weren't arguments, but cases he built against her, how she'd learned to stop pushing back not because she was wrong, but because the cost of being right was never worth what it took. She spoke about Liam, how staying had been about him, and also, if she was being truthful, about the version of herself that still believed something would change. She described the day she understood it wouldn't, not dramatically, not with a single incident, but as a quiet arriving at a conclusion she'd been building toward for years. She said, "I didn't leave because I was afraid of losing. I stayed because I thought love meant trying longer." I understand now that he was counting on that. The courtroom was absolutely still. Vanessa, on the bench, had been neutral for 12 days. She had maintained the discipline that 26 years on the bench had made second nature. The separation of the personal and the professional, the face that recorded and assessed without revealing. She'd learned it young, kept it sharp, applied it so consistently that it had become, over time, almost identical with who she was rather than simply a function of what she did. But Elena's voice, describing an isolation she hadn't known the full dimensions of, describing the financial trap, describing the years of quiet erosion, it arrived somewhere in Vanessa that her professional discipline had no procedure for. She had known, in the abstract, that the marriage had been damaging. She'd seen the evidence. She'd reviewed the documentation. She'd understood intellectually what had happened to her daughter across 7 years. Understanding it intellectually was not the same as sitting in a room and hearing Elena describe learning not to push back. Hearing her daughter who had her posture and her way of holding a room and her precise, undecorated manner of stating a thing, describe making herself smaller so that the day could pass without incident. Vanessa kept her face still. She kept her hands still. She breathed evenly and looked at the record and at counsel and at the gallery, the way she always did. But something had moved in her that she would not be managing back into stillness anytime soon. Daniel attempted one last redirection. His attorney, during cross-examination, raised the question of Elena's therapy records, the same intake forms that had been introduced in the opening sessions, the ones used to suggest instability. He framed it carefully, trying to resurrect the narrative that had been so thoroughly dismantled by this point, reaching for any available foothold. Elena had answered 2 questions before Vanessa cut across the examination. "Counselor." Vanessa's voice was level, precise. "This court has already reviewed this documentation in context. I've read the intake form in question. It reflects a person seeking voluntary support during a documented period of elevated stress, a period, I would note, that the record now suggests was deliberately manufactured." She looked at Daniel's attorney with the steady attention of someone who has decided something. Entering that document again as evidence of instability is not a line of questioning this court will permit. Move on. The attorney moved on. He didn't have anywhere else to go. Daniel sat at his table and said nothing. The child psychologist's report was read into the record near the end of the afternoon. Dr. Sarah Merritt had evaluated Liam over 3 sessions. Her report was careful and specific, written in the deliberate language of someone who understood that every word would be scrutinized and had chosen each one accordingly. She reported that Liam demonstrated a strong, secure attachment to his mother, that in her sessions with him, he spoke about his home with his mother using language associated with safety, predictability, and warmth. That when asked about his father, his responses showed patterns consistent with a child who has experienced an unpredictable emotional environment. Heightened alertness, carefully managed answers, a tendency to qualify his statements in ways atypical for a 6-year-old. She reported one specific statement Liam had made in their second session, which she quoted directly. "When Daddy gets upset, I get very quiet, so he doesn't get more upset. Mommy doesn't get upset like that." The courtroom absorbed this in silence. Elena, in her seat, pressed her hands flat against the table. Not to steady herself, she was steady. To stay present. To resist the pull toward the particular grief of a mother hearing her child's careful, calibrated love language and understanding what had produced it. Across the room, Daniel's hands had gone still again. Different from before, not the stillness of calculation. The stillness of a man who had just been told something he couldn't argue with and couldn't reframe and couldn't manage or deflect or absorb into a counter-narrative. He had done that to his son. The record said so. In the words of a 6-year-old who had learned to go very quiet. Vanessa closed the session just before 5. She announced that final arguments would begin the following morning. Her voice was the same as it had been every day, measured, authoritative, precise. She ran through the procedural summary with the same efficiency she always brought. Then she looked at the room for a moment before dismissing it. Not at anyone specifically, at the room. The way you look at something when you've understood what it contains. Daniel was already gathering his papers. His attorney was speaking to him in a low voice. He nodded without listening. Elena sat still until most of the gallery had cleared. Rachel put her hand briefly on Elena's forearm, not a gesture that required a response, just a presence acknowledged, and then went to speak to a court officer about tomorrow's schedule. Elena looked at the bench. Vanessa was reviewing something, her pen moving in the margin of a document, her face showing the work of a person who wasn't finished for the day even though the session was over. She didn't look up. Elena didn't wait for her to. She gathered her bag, straightened her jacket, and walked out of the courtroom into the corridor, her footsteps even, her spine straight, carrying with her the full weight of everything she'd said out loud today and the specific lightness that sometimes followed the saying of it. Tomorrow, final arguments. Tomorrow, judgment. She took the stairs instead of the elevator, moving through the quiet building, out through the glass doors, into the evening air that smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet. She had one stop to make before going home. Liam was waiting. The courtroom on day 15 was a different thing entirely from the room Elena had walked into 12 days ago. It had the same walls, the same bench, the same gallery seating worn smooth at the edges from years of people sitting through difficult things. But the air in it was different, denser, the kind of atmosphere that collects when a story has been building long enough that the people watching it understand, without being told, that today is the day it resolves. Every seat was filled. The media section had expanded. A court officer had set up a secondary row of chairs along the side wall to accommodate the overflow. Legal professionals who had followed the public record of the past 2 weeks sat in the gallery with the particular attention of people who were here professionally but had become, somewhere along the way, personally invested. Daniel's former colleagues from his firm were conspicuously absent. The seats where his associates had once arranged themselves with the easy confidence of a team that expected to win sat empty in the front row, which said more than any statement of distancing his firm had released. Elena arrived early. She sat at her table and looked straight ahead and breathed. Rachel arrived 8 minutes later, set her files down with practiced efficiency, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said quietly, "You ready?" Elena thought about the question honestly. "I've been ready for longer than I knew," she said. Rachel nodded once. That was enough. Daniel arrived 7 minutes before proceedings began. He came in through the side door, not the main entrance, where the press had positioned themselves. He was in a dark suit, still pressed, still correct. But the suit felt like armor now rather than confidence, the careful maintenance of a form whose substance had eroded. His single attorney walked beside him. carrying a briefcase that Elena suspected contained considerably less than it once would have. He sat down without looking at her. She noted this and returned her attention to the front of the room. Vanessa entered on the hour. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone rose. Vanessa walked to the bench with the same measured authority she'd carried every day of these proceedings. Robe straight, posture exact, the face that had been trained over decades to say nothing and mean it. She sat. She reviewed something in the folder before her. She looked at the room. "We're here for final arguments," she said. "Counsel for the respondent." Rachel stood. What followed was not theatrical. Elena had half expected it to be, had imagined, in the nights leading up to this, something dramatic and soaring, the kind of closing argument you saw in films where a lawyer's voice filled a room and made something transcendent happen. Rachel was not that kind of lawyer, and this was not that kind of moment. What Rachel delivered was better than that. She spoke for 22 minutes in the even, unhurried voice of someone who had done the work and trusted it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't reach for language designed to impress. She had the record, and she walked through it with the confidence of a person who had built something solid and was simply showing the room what it looked like. "This case," she said, near the beginning, "was filed as a custody dispute. What the record shows is something more deliberate than that. The pattern documented in these proceedings, manufactured instability narratives, strategically timed financial maneuvering, orchestrated testimony, judicial assignment irregularities, was not reactive. It was architectural. It was built in advance of this courtroom to ensure that when Elena Brooks walked through those doors, she would find the walls already arranged against her." She paused, letting that land. The purpose of that architecture was not custody. Custody was the instrument. The purpose was control, the continuation of a control that had operated throughout this marriage and needed a legal mechanism to survive the marriage's end. She moved through the evidence methodically, the asset transfers and their timing, Olson's recantation and what it revealed about the witness preparation process, Diane Whitfield's testimony and the pattern it established across cases, the court assignment irregularities, Liam's psychologist report. She returned, at the end, to the simplest point. Elena Brooks sat in this courtroom and told the truth. She told it clearly, without embellishment, without performance. The record supports everything she said. The record contradicts the narrative that was built against her. Rachel looked at Vanessa. "We ask that the court see what the record shows." She sat down. Daniel's attorney stood. His name was Craig Billings, competent, careful, and operating without resources. He'd been handed a position that had been losing ground for 8 days and asked to defend it in a room that had watched every piece of its foundation get examined and found wanting. He did what he could with it. He cited Elena's documented periods of emotional difficulty. Vanessa's expression didn't shift, but something in the quality of her attention sharpened almost imperceptibly. Elena caught it, or thought she did. He argued that the financial matters, while requiring further review, were separate from the question of Liam's best interests. He argued that Daniel's relationship with his son was genuine and important and should not be casualty of proceedings that had expanded beyond their original scope. He spoke for 14 minutes. He sat down with the particular careful blankness of a professional who has done his job and knows it wasn't enough. Then Daniel asked to speak. Billings put a hand on his arm, a brief, firm pressure that said, "I would advise against this." Daniel removed his arm from the contact and stood. Vanessa looked at him. "You may address the court briefly, Mr. Brooks." He stood at his table rather than approaching the front of the room. Elena thought that was probably a decision his body made rather than his mind. The front of the room requiring a forward movement he no longer quite had in him. He began with Liam. He spoke about his son with something that might, in a different context, have sounded genuine. The mornings, the routines, the particular ways they knew each other. And perhaps it was genuine. Elena had never doubted that Daniel loved Liam, in whatever way Daniel was capable of love. That had never been the question. But then the thing that had been waiting underneath his composure for 12 days surfaced one final time. "I gave that family everything," he said. His voice had changed, not loud, but compressed, like pressure finding a seam. "I built a life. I provided. Everything she had, everything Liam had. The school, the home, the stability. I did that. And this," he stopped, started again. "I made mistakes. I know that. But the idea that I'm being stood here like I'm some kind of... He stopped again. The room waited. His attorney was very still in his chair. I built everything, Daniel said. Quieter now. She had nothing without me. He sat down. The words settled in the room. Not with the immediate, physical impact of the outburst on day 3. This was different. Smaller, in one sense, and in another sense much larger. Because day 3 had been a man losing his temper in a moment. This was a man, with 12 days of exposure behind him, with everything documented and entered into record, with a room full of people who knew exactly what the evidence showed, still saying the same thing, still returning, at the end, to the same belief. That belief was the whole story. Everything else had been its consequences. Vanessa looked at the room for a long moment after Daniel sat down. It was the pause Rachel had mentioned to Elena once, early in the case. The way a good judge took the room's temperature before ruling, not because they hadn't decided, but because judgment deserved a moment of wait before it was spoken. Elena had understood the description in theory. Watching it now, she understood it differently. She watched her mother sit with the full complexity of this moment. The judge who had presided over 12 days of documented abuse and its unraveling, and the mother who had just heard a man say, one final time, that her daughter had nothing without him. Vanessa's hands were flat on the bench. Her face was still. Whatever she was carrying, she carried it alone, the way she always had, and then she set it down and spoke. This court has reviewed the evidence presented over 15 days of proceedings, Vanessa said. The record is comprehensive. I will speak to the central matters. She looked at the file before her, though Elena had the strong sense she didn't need it. On the matter of custody, the evidence does not support a finding that Elena Brooks is an unfit parent. It supports the opposite. The documentation presented, including the independent psychological assessment, establishes that Liam Brooks has a secure, stable, and nurturing relationship with his mother, and that his primary residence with her serves his best interests. She paused. Full custody is awarded to Elena Brooks. Daniel Brooks is granted supervised visitation to be structured through the Family Court Services Division. The gallery exhaled. Not celebration, something more complicated. The sound of a room releasing something it had been holding. On the matter of professional conduct, the evidence entered into this record regarding witness preparation, financial misrepresentation, and judicial assignment irregularities warrants formal review beyond the scope of this proceeding. This court's findings will be forwarded in full to the State Bar Association. A formal recommendation for legal review of the matters identified will accompany that referral. Billings was writing something. Daniel was sitting perfectly still. Additionally, Vanessa continued, the materials identified in this proceeding regarding asset concealment will be referred to the relevant financial oversight bodies for independent review. The court has preserved all documentation accordingly. She looked up from the file. These proceedings are concluded. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down. The sound that followed was not silence. It was the layered sound of a room processing, the low surge of the gallery, cameras from the media section, Billings leaning toward Daniel and speaking in a voice too low to carry, the specific rustling of people who had been sitting still for a long time and were now permitted to move. Elena sat exactly where she was. Rachel turned to her, and her face had the carefully contained quality of someone who is very happy and is managing it out of professional habit. She put her hand briefly over Elena's on the table and then withdrew it. We're done, she said. Simply, we're done, Elena repeated. She said it again, silently, to herself, testing the weight of it, finding that it held. She looked toward the front of the room. Vanessa had already stood, was already moving to gather her materials. The professional transition, the bench to the chambers, the judge becoming simply a person again. She didn't look at Elena. Elena looked at her for one moment, and in that moment understood something she hadn't found language for yet. Something about what it meant to watch someone do the right thing in the hardest possible way. Something about the difference between being saved and being witnessed. Then she stood, straightened her jacket, and turned toward the door. Daniel walked out alone. She saw it from across the lobby. He came out of the courtroom behind her, his attorney beside him, but already angling away, already checking his phone, already moving into the next part of his day the way professional people did when one matter concluded and another required attention. He said something to Billings. Billings responded. And then Billings walked toward the building's east exit, and Daniel stood in the lobby with his briefcase and his pressed dark suit and the absence of everyone who had once arranged themselves around him. No senior partners, no associates, no carefully assembled team of people whose proximity to him had once conferred something worth having. He stood there for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then he walked toward the exit, and the doors closed behind him, and the lobby resumed its ordinary weekday life as if he'd never been in it. Elena watched the doors close. Then she took out her phone and called Liam's school. The suspension came 6 weeks later. Elena read about it the way she'd read most of the subsequent news, on her phone, early in the morning, before Liam was awake. A brief item in Patricia Graves' legal column. Daniel Brooks's law license had been suspended, pending the outcome of the Bar Association's investigation. His firm had issued a statement confirming his departure. The statement used the word mutual in the way that word is used when it means the opposite. She put her phone down and poured her coffee and stood at the kitchen window. The street below was its ordinary morning self. A woman walking a dog. A delivery truck negotiating a tight turn. The specific, unhurried quality of a neighborhood that didn't know or care what had happened in any particular courtroom in any particular week. She had thought she might feel something dramatic when the news arrived. Satisfaction, maybe, or the particular relief of a door locking permanently shut. But what she felt was quieter than either of those things. Something closer to the feeling of setting down a weight you've been carrying long enough that you forgot it was weight. The moment when you realize your hands are empty and your shoulders are level and the absence of the thing is simply ordinary life. The headlines had flipped completely in the weeks since the verdict. Woman wins custody after exposing legal abuse by prominent attorney. That had been the first wave. Then the follow-up pieces, the longer profiles, the investigations that had used the court record as a starting point for examining other cases, other outcomes, other people who had signed settlements that now looked different in retrospect. 2 more women had come forward in the weeks following Diane Whitfield's testimony. Their cases were under review. Elena had spoken to neither of them directly. She didn't need to. She understood what it had taken them to say what they'd said, the same way Diane had understood what it took Elena. That kind of recognition didn't require words. Rachel had been featured in 3 separate profiles. She'd handled each one with the same no-frills earnestness she brought to everything. She'd told one journalist, in a quote Elena had read 4 times, "She did the work. I just finally had a room that let me do my job." Elena had texted her after reading that. Rachel had texted back, "Don't cry, we have more work to do." Followed, after a pause, by a single emoji she would have claimed was ironic. Liam laughed again. Not that he'd stopped entirely. Children were more resilient than adults in the moment, even when the damage was accumulating beneath the surface. But there was a quality to his laughter now that had been missing. A looseness. A willingness to be fully in a moment without that small background monitoring that Elena had noticed and not known how to name. He'd started sleeping without the turtle lamp, which he'd announced one evening as a straightforward fact and never mentioned again. He'd started bringing friends home from school, 2 boys from his class. A girl named Petra with opinions about everything who Elena had liked immediately. The apartment, which had been a quiet place for a long time, had become loud in the best possible way on certain afternoons. He'd also, in the disarming way of 6-year-olds, asked Elena one morning whether she was happy now. She'd been making his lunch. She'd stopped and looked at him. He was watching her with his serious face, the one that meant he'd been thinking about something for a while and had decided to say it. "Yes," she told him. "I am." He'd nodded, satisfied, and gone back to his cereal. Elena had turned back to his sandwich and taken a breath and held it for a moment before letting it go. She found a new job in the 7th week. Not through Daniel's network. Not through any of the channels that had felt, for years, like they technically existed but practically required his endorsement to actually work. Through her own connections, people she'd worked with before, people who'd known her before she'd made herself smaller, people who had simply been waiting, it turned out, for her to be available again. The role was with a community health organization, different from her previous work, but adjacent to it in the ways that mattered. Work that connected to something she actually cared about. The salary wasn't what Daniel had once told her she should consider her floor. It was enough. It was hers. She'd signed the offer letter at the kitchen table, the same table where the divorce papers had sat untouched for 3 days. And then she'd taken Liam out for ice cream and let him get the size he always asked for and was always previously told was too large, and watched him work through it with focused, joyful determination, getting it everywhere, completely unbothered. She'd thought, this is what rebuilding looks like. Not grand, not cinematic. Ice cream on a Tuesday, a signed letter, a new key on her keychain. Daniel existed, in the weeks after the verdict, in the way of a person whose context has been completely removed. He had a small apartment in a neighborhood that had nothing to do with the life he'd built. No proximity to the firm, no geography that connected him to the professional world that had organized his identity. He had the car, for now. He had the suit he'd worn to court, hanging in a closet that contained considerably less than it once had. He had no clients, no colleagues who called, no morning to organize around. The structure that had held everything, the firm, the cases, the authority, the careful architecture of reputation and resource, had been removed piece by piece, and what remained was simply a man in an apartment, which was a thing that could be anyone and was therefore, for a person who had defined himself entirely by being someone specifically, almost nothing at all. His supervised visitation with Liam was scheduled to begin in the following month. He had not contested the terms. His attorney had advised against it, and for once, he'd taken the advice. Elena didn't think about him much. When she did, it wasn't with hatred or satisfaction. It was with the clear, neutral recognition of someone looking at the consequences of a thing and understanding them as exactly that, consequences. Not a punishment she'd authored, just the natural result of what he'd built and how it had been built. Vanessa came to the apartment on a Sunday afternoon, 5 weeks after the verdict. Not in her robes, not in any version of official capacity. She arrived in an ordinary coat, carrying a small plant, a succulent in a dark pot. The kind of gift you bring when you want to bring something and don't want it to be flowers, which feel too much like ceremony. Elena let her in. Liam, who had heard about his grandmother in the careful and limited way Elena had managed to discuss her, regarded Vanessa from the kitchen doorway with the assessing seriousness of a child who understood he was meeting someone important and was forming his own opinion about it. Vanessa looked at him with an expression Elena had never seen on her mother's face, something unguarded and wondering. The look of a person confronting something that makes the structures they've built feel suddenly very small. "Hi," Liam said. "Hi," Vanessa said. He went back to his drawing. Vanessa set the plant on the kitchen counter. They sat at the table, the same table, always this table, and Elena made tea, and they were quiet for a while in the way of two people who have more to say than either has a good order for. Vanessa spoke first. "I've been thinking about what I said to you on the street," she said. "And what you said back." Elena waited. "I spent a long time believing that the right way to love you was to make you hard enough to survive whatever came." Vanessa looked at her hands around the mug. "I thought strength meant being unbreakable. That if I taught you to be unbreakable, I'd done my job." She paused. "I watched you in that courtroom for 15 days. And you were strong, but not the way I taught you. You were strong because you knew who you were. That wasn't for me." Elena was quiet for a moment. She looked at the plan on the counter. Small, contained, precisely the kind of thing that took care but didn't demand. "It was partly from you," she said finally. "I just had to figure out which part." Vanessa looked at her. Her face did something complicated. Elena took a breath. "I didn't need you to be perfect," she said. "I needed you to be there. You weren't. For a long time, you weren't. And I needed to say that to you. I still need that to be true." She looked at her mother. "But I don't need it to be all you are." The kitchen was quiet. From the living room, Liam's drawing was apparently going very well. She could hear the particular satisfied sound he made when something was coming out the way he wanted it. Vanessa nodded once. Not an agreement, exactly. More like an acknowledgement that this was where they were, and that it was honest, and that honest was the only possible beginning. They didn't embrace. They didn't dissolve the 4 years of silence in a single afternoon. That wasn't what this was. But they finished their tea, and Vanessa asked about Liam's drawing, and Elena called him in. And he showed his grandmother the elaborate scene he'd constructed of what appeared to be a dragon helping someone build a house, explaining it with the complete confidence of a 6-year-old who knows exactly what his art means and doesn't need it validated. Vanessa looked at the drawing with real attention. "It's very good," she said. She meant it. Liam accepted this as his due and went back to work. 3 months after the verdict, Elena walked out of a courthouse again. She had been there for a routine matter. Paperwork in the finalization of the divorce settlement, the kind of procedural step that required her presence, but not her full attention. She'd signed what needed signing, answered what needed answering, and walked back out through the glass doors into an afternoon that had decided, at the last minute, to be warmer than forecast. Liam was with her. He'd come because there was no school that day, and Rachel, who sometimes took him for the afternoon when Elena had things to handle, had a conflict. He'd held her hand through the lobby, asked her 4 questions about the vending machine they'd passed, and was now walking slightly ahead of her on the courthouse steps, negotiating each step as its own separate challenge. Elena stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at the building. The same building, different light, entirely different life. She thought about who she'd been the first time she'd walked in here. The divorce papers in her bag, the years of compression behind her, the case already set up against her before she'd had a chance to speak. She thought about the specific quality of fear she'd carried then. Not a dramatic fear, but a quiet one. The fear of someone who has been told, in so many ways over so many years, that they are less than what they are. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not because the world had become fair, it hadn't. Not because the structures that had been used against her no longer existed, they did. Not because she'd been saved by the right person arriving at the right moment. She understood now that she'd been fighting the whole time, in every quiet way, and that the fighting had mattered long before anyone witnessed it. She was not afraid anymore, because she had stood in a room full of people who had expected her to lose, and she had told the truth clearly, and the truth had been enough. "Mama, come on," Liam called from the sidewalk. He had found something of interest near the base of a lamppost, and was crouching to examine it with the focused intensity he brought to anything that required his full scientific attention. "Coming," she said. She walked down the last 2 steps and took his hand, and they moved down the street together in the afternoon light. Liam explaining his findings at the lamppost in considerable detail, Elena listening, head held exactly as high as it needed to be. Peace. Not the kind that comes from the world becoming easier. The kind that comes from knowing what you're made of. The kind you keep. Some people use power to control others. Others learn to survive it and rise anyway. If someone spent years making you feel like you were nothing, would you have the strength to let the truth speak for you? Or would you have broken long before the world could see it? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe. We have more stories that will stay with you long after they're over.